Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and see if we can uncover the hidden structural forces that are really driving the outcomes of global football. So, if you tuned into the 2026 World Cup, you know it was just a wildly historic tournament, right? I mean, we had a record 9 African nations advancing out of the group stages. And if you're like me, you probably felt that electric energy, that absolute emotional high of seeing underdogs completely command the pitch. But beneath the surface of all those thrilling matches lies a really fascinating and highly stratified economic hierarchy. Today, we're going way beyond the X's and O's. We're looking at the macro structural financial realities that dictate exactly what happens when the clock ticks past the 90th minute. Because honestly, this is the core mystery of the 2026 World Cup. Why did so many of these brilliant African and Caribbean teams that honestly looked dominant for the first 70 minutes, just suddenly fall apart in the final moments of knockout matches? We saw these incredible starting lineups absolutely gas out. They lost their defensive shape, and they conceded these just heartbreaking late goals. And you know what? This wasn't a coincidence, and it definitely wasn't a lack of athletic willpower. The hard data from the tournament tells a crystal clear story about exactly when these defensive walls came crashing down. We're looking at a massive cluster of late-game deficits. Think about Senegal. They were up 2-0 against Belgium at the hour mark, only to concede in the 86th, the 89th, and eventually the 120th minute. Cabo Verde was holding Argentina, the reigning champions, to a 1-1 tie, but then completely collapsed in extra time. Haiti and Tunisia? Exact same pattern against deeply resourced opponents. The numbers point to a lethal concentration of defensive breakdowns happening right in the tactical danger zone, which is the final 15 minutes of regulation and deep into extra time. Which brings us to Section 1, the extra time heartbreaks and the severe conditioning drop-off. Let's break down that Senegal match in the round of 32. Senegal comes out executing this flawless, asymmetrical 4-2-4 high press. They completely suffocated Belgium early on and took a commanding 2-0 lead by the 51st minute. It was incredible to watch, but those intense tactics absolutely burned out their rest defense. So trailing by 2, Belgium just leveraged its immense multi-billion euro squad depth. They just kept sending on a continuous wave of fresh, world-class attackers. Guys like Romelu Lukaku and Yuri Tielemans. Senegal simply didn't have the bench to counter that kind of physical freshness. I mean, it really wasn't a fair fight once the clock hit 90 minutes. That staggering asymmetry is what allowed Belgium to erase the lead in the dying moments and ultimately win it on a penalty. And we saw a strikingly similar narrative unfold in Miami. Cabo Verde put on a remarkable performance, tying Argentina 1-1 deep into the second half. But then, Argentina went to their vast reserves. They brought on elite forwards like Julian Alvarez and Nicolas Gonzalez. Cabo Verde tried to match that rotation, but the disparity in technical quality between the two benches was just insurmountable. Cabo Verde's starters could easily run with the champions, but the sheer physical and cognitive fatigue caused by Argentina's world-class bench inevitably broke their structural discipline. It actually resulted in a devastating 111th minute own goal, purely born out of exhaustion. So there is actually a definitive term for this tactical dilemma, the squad depth trap. If you've ever screamed at your TV, wondering why managers make these seemingly risky offensive subs late in the game, well, mathematical modeling using expected goals proves that it actually works. Swapping a fatigued player for one with fresh legs mathematically improves your offensive output. Elite managers use their bench to actively hunt tired defenders. But if you're managing an emerging nation, you might have a world-class starting 11, but a substandard bench. So you are faced with a terrible choice. Keeping exhausted elite players on the pitch becomes a fatal necessity. You literally have to risk defensive errors and injury because the drop-off in technical skill in your bench is just way too severe. And this trap is particularly brutal for African and Caribbean nations that rely heavily on the diaspora model. Think about it. When a powerhouse makes a substitution, the tactical intensity of the game actually rises. But when an emerging nation goes to the bench, the technical quality falls off a cliff. A nation might field a starting lineup of absolute premier players who are active in Europe's top leagues, but players 15 through 23 on that roster, they're often pulled from completely uncompetitive, undercapitalized domestic leagues. As the physical toll of the game normalizes everything late in a match, a severely fatigued world-class defender becomes incredibly susceptible to a totally fresh, elite European attacker. Let's move to Section 2, the economics of scarcity, where we unpack the financial reality behind all of this. Get a load of this number, 3.4 billion euros. That is UEFA's direct financial distribution to its participating European clubs in just a single season, the 2024 to 2025 season. It's part of a massive ecosystem that's poised to surpass 30 billion euros in total revenue. This intense centralization of wealth allows for massive internal redistribution. It ensures that even lower-tier European leagues maintain a baseline of infrastructure and coaching that peripheral confederations just simply cannot match. Now contrast that staggering figure with $17.6 million. That is the entire prize money pool for the CAF Champions League, which is Africa's premier club competition. It represents a profound financial starvation at the club level. When you put those two numbers side by side, the European prize pool is roughly 200 times larger. 200! This financial starvation makes it impossible for African and Caribbean teams to offer competitive wages, which triggers an immediate exodus of their premier talent at very, very young ages. And this leads to a really devastating reality on the ground. Basic infrastructural necessities have to be subsidized, rather than being commercially sustained. A lot of federations rely entirely on FIFA Forward funding literally just to keep the lights on, to buy floodlights and turf. Recently, Jamaica's under-20 team didn't even have the funds for international practice matches. They had to rely on local clubs instead. Haiti's football infrastructure was largely annihilated in the 2010 earthquake, and they are still struggling with non-existent transport and a lack of safe venues. And when domestic purchasing power is low, the stadiums sit empty. That completely breaks the commercial loop required for any kind of league sustainability. Section 3. Anatomy of the leg drain. Let's look at how talent extraction actually works. So we can actually track this systemic migration of human capital. It's known as the leg drain. Elite athletic talent is harvested from origin academies out in the periphery, mostly the CAF and CONCACAF nations. Those players move up to the wealthy clubs in the core UEFA leagues, where they generate billions of dollars in commercial and broadcast value. But the catch is there's virtually no financial redistribution returning to those origin ecosystems. The wealth goes one way, and all the origin leagues get are some limited, centralized subsidies. And we have the economic data to prove it. This is a highly systematic wealth transfer, operating basically as an athletic brain drain. Researchers analyzed a global labor market of over 92,000 professional footballers using a gravity model. And what they found is that wealthy host nations are acquiring fully developed athletes without having to bear any of the foundational costs of raising them, the early social and athletic development. Just to put that in perspective, France alone is estimated to have gained over 3 billion euros in implied player value through this mechanism. And historically speaking, former colonial ties remain some of the absolutely strongest predictors of how intense this extraction is. Former FIFA president Sepp Blatter once described this process in incredibly stark terms. Now, while this language is obviously deliberately provocative, it really hits on the severe institutional nature of a transfer system that's designed purely as closed-loop corporate transactions. These deals happen strictly between the clubs. The origin governments and the local communities that actually raised, fed, and developed these players, they receive absolutely zero official monthly or annual remittances from their exportation. It leaves the domestic leagues completely hollowed out. Section 4. Pragmatism versus panic. How are teams adjusting tactically? Remember Senegal's exhausting high press? Compare that to the tactical pivot we saw from Egypt. Egypt went with a super compact 5-man low block. They willingly surrendered possession. They basically just let the opponent pass the ball harmlessly in front of them, which resulted in a massive passes per defensive action, or PPDA, of almost 16. The logic here? It allowed them to conserve immense amounts of energy. Sure, it wasn't flashy or aggressive, but it gave them the legs to survive a full 120 minutes and actually win their shootout against Australia. Morocco is a great example of how targeted state investment in domestic infrastructure, paired with strict tactical pragmatism, can effectively neutralize the squad depth trap. Morocco used a highly disciplined 4-4-2 mid-block. They shifted side to side in unison, completely abandoning any sort of emotional, run-and-gun, isolated sprints that waste energy. But here's the crucial part. This tactical discipline was backed by real domestic strength. Back in 2009, a $16.8 million investment built the Mohammed VI Football Academy, a world-class facility that cultivated a whole new generation of elite domestic talent. They weren't solely reliant on the diaspora, meaning they actually had the depth to advance past the Netherlands. Finally, Section 5, Fixing the Asymmetric Pitch. What kind of structural reform is actually needed? If we want to reverse this trend, we have to replace unregulated extraction with systemic capitalization. Emerging leagues need to be able to retain players and build true, deep 23-man rosters. The academic literature strongly recommends implementing binding international legal frameworks. So picture an automated clearinghouse that actually taxes wealthy host leagues like the Premier League or La Liga for utilizing non-domestic human capital. If you redistribute a percentage of those massive profits back to the specific developmental ecosystems, you fund local youth academies and allow for competitive domestic wages. On top of that, aggressively commercializing regional tournaments like the CFU Club Shield in the Caribbean could create independent recurring revenue that stays in the region. Until the actual economic architecture of the sport changes, we really have to ask if these breathtaking individual talents are just doomed to routinely expire in the exhausting, depth-starved twilight of extra time. The 2026 World Cup proved, without a doubt, that the failures of emerging nations aren't due to a lack of tactical smarts or athletic courage. They are the direct, mathematically inevitable outcomes of a fundamentally unequal structure. So what do you think? Is the global game finally going to implement the wealth redistribution necessary to level the pitch? Or is the squad depth trap just the permanent feature of international football?